What do these kind of fragile dynamics and relationships look like then? What if I were to step into a neighborhood? How would I see that it's fragile? What's the symptoms that stand out most? If I were to walk around in DC and suddenly I cross the street, and then what do I see if I step into one of these fragile neighborhoods?
So first, maybe I'll take a step back and think about how do I think of fragility. Most people think of fragility in a very technical matter. They're thinking what is not working in this country. So you get all these lists of the ministries aren't working, the government isn't working, there's corruption, and so it's very technical. The education level isn't high enough, something wrong with the infrastructure, what have you. So you can find lots of people working on fragility or conflict prevention or things related to fragility. It could be humanitarian, it could be in the economic developmental sphere, but we're working on a set of countries, a set of issues, and we too often think about it technically, or we too often think about it as a series of material problems. Now, I think of fragility from the beginning in a very different manner. I always have thought about fragility in terms of relationships. The success or failure of a country ultimately is about the nature of relationships. We're taught that states work or don't work because of institutions, but I ask everyone to go a step before that. What are institutions? They are based upon the relationships that people have with each other. So if we think about relationships, then we think about institutions, formal and informal, and then we think how countries work. So going back to your question, I think in the fragile states, you tend to walk around and you often see thriving communities, thriving neighborhoods. And what that means is strong families, strong interfamily relationships, a lot of social activities in the streets, in the local shops, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's just the things you might see. There's much more than that. But then if you go to the national level, you'll see that they're often divided between different groups, ethnic, religious, geographic, clan. I mean, it varies place to place, but you don't have the types of relationships of trust, the type of cohesion, the type of bridging mechanism, institutions that will bring people together to work together to a common end. If you go to the United States, and this is where I ended up with neighborhoods, United States, and I would say other developed countries, they work generally very well at the national level. I mean, the United States has a government that, for all of its flaws, and it does have flaws, it does have dysfunction in Congress, it does have state institutions which are, I would say, somewhat stale, a bit slow, lethargic, and so on, bureaucratic. It works, and it's worked for decades, if not much longer. It depends how you want to date the age of the federal government. And then you have states, and then you have a very dynamic civil society, and then you have these incredibly dynamic companies. But if you go to the local level, you see a great decay in relationships. You see everything from family breakdown to household instability. You see people who live in the same neighborhood and never talk to each other. And I'll just draw a contrast. I was speaking to someone yesterday, a professor at NYU working in the urban area, and she was just explaining that by accident, I was speaking to her for a completely different reason, but talking about this idea of neighborhoods. She explained that when she first moved to NYU, she found a place to live about an hour away in the middle of no place in Connecticut. They were going to spend a year there and then move on. But what they discovered was a thriving place, neighborhood, partly because it was cut off from other areas, a little isolated, but a thriving neighborhood versus a fragile neighborhood. A thriving neighborhood, people have deep, and I see it in my neighborhood, people have deep relationships with each other. They know personal details about each other. Their kids play with each other. They're in civic associations. They're in schools. they're in the shopping, they're on the street, they're in the playground, they're visiting people's homes. There's thick bonds and there's overlapping institutions where people meet. They meet for a purpose, and they often meet without a purpose. They meet spontaneously. And there's a certain amount of joy and a certain amount of excitement and a certain amount of flourishing that pervades people's lives because they're in a flourishing place, and it affects so many other things which we can talk about. If you're in a fragile neighborhood, that could mean either a poor place that's isolated, a lot of instability at the family household level, not very good institutions, and people might support each other, but everything is very weak, everything is very fragile, and the opportunity is limited. But you could also be in a materially very well-off neighborhood and nobody will know each other. Everything is solved through the phone, through the app, through spending money. And if you have a crisis, all you know to do is to go to a hospital or go to your app. You don't have anybody in your immediate neighborhood that you have any relationship on that you can depend on.